Hello everyone, this is Sam Spade with the last tutorial in the Buttons Design and GameMaker Studio 2.3 tutorial series. In this tutorial, I'm just going to go over some of the design ideas we covered in the series. The first and most important idea, of course, is that you should design your code. This I think is obvious, but it can be easy to skip this critical step. And this isn't always bad, but if you ever get stuck, it's probably a good indicator that you didn't actually sit down and think through your design enough. Next, we have experiment with different designs. There are often many different ways to solve the same problem, and just because you've solved the problem one way doesn't necessarily mean you should stop thinking about other ways to solve it. Maybe other ways will be easier down the road, easier to maintain, easier to give to other people or to work with other people, or just better for one reason or another. You should also document your designs. You can do this in many different ways. You can do it, of course, with comments in your code. That's one of the most common ways. But don't overlook outside design documents. They don't need to be complicated, but writing some things down can be a great way to remember what you did later on, or again, to pass your code along to other people. I obviously do this for these tutorials where the whole point of the tutorial is to explain to other people what I'm doing, but often you will find yourself in a similar position when you are passing along your code to someone else, working on a project with other people, trying to make an asset for the marketplace, or asking for help on the forums. In all of these cases, having some type of documentation of your design can be invaluable. Don't be afraid of iterative design. If you go back and look at the buttons that we created in the first tutorial versus the buttons that we were working with in the final tutorial, they're actually substantially different. The later buttons are a lot more complicated, but they also do a lot more things. We got to the more complicated versions by iteratively going through the process of redesigning them at every step. We thought of what we wanted to do, we wrote the code to do that, and then down the road we decided, oh, we want this button to do a little bit more. We want it to handle this other use case, to do something else, and so we redesigned the code. I think that's a very effective way to program in general. Design for what you know right now. Don't just try to cover all of the possibilities at once. Write code for the thing that you want to do, and then if what you want to do changes, iterate on that code and improve upon it. And this leads to the next one, which is don't write code until you actually need it. And also delete code you aren't using. If you want to do A, only write enough code to do A. You know, when we created simple buttons that we just wanted to interact with, we just wrote the code for those simple buttons. And as a result, those buttons were very simple and took really only a few lines to actually create. If you don't need to interact with your buttons using the keyboard, then there's no reason to write all of that code. And think about how much additional work it was to write the code to interact with a keyboard versus to just write that code to interact with a tap or a click. Imagine if you are always trying to create the more complicated version to handle all eventualities. You will create a lot more work for yourself. Now, sometimes that will actually need to be done. Some things are, of course, complicated, and you'll have to spend the time to create it. But again, don't write code until you actually need it, and delete the code that you aren't using. We talked about using inheritance to avoid repeating code. I personally prefer a pretty shallow inheritance structure. I think deep inheritance, where you're going down 5, 10, 15 objects, can get pretty messy and just as hard to maintain as not using inheritance, but use inheritance to avoid repeating code. We talked about using managers to interface with multiple objects. So we created a mouse manager so that we didn't select multiple buttons at once. And then we created a keyboard manager so we could interact with the buttons with the keyboard. And then last, we talked about creating and using local asset packages to speed up your development in the future, creating resources that you can carry with you from project to project. And that's everything. Thanks for watching.